given our guests today as well. Before we get there, I want to introduce our moderator. Our moderator is Nicole Ferrero. Nicole, come on out. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you. How are you?
Hello, great to see you.
Yes, you too. So Nicole, you actually are the editorial director of the Webby Awards, but there is something else you do as well, which is you're the founder and director of Art, Humanity, and Action, which is a podcast. Talk a little bit about it.
Sure. It's actually a live storytelling show and a podcast. So it's actually something I started in the 5 days following the 2016 election when I didn't want to get out of bed or ever talk to anybody again. I thought a lot of people were probably feeling that way. So as a member of the storytelling community in New York, I brought together as many storytellers as I could to tell stories about compassion and love and unity from their personal lives, and then we donated all the ticket money to the Anti-Violence Project. So we basically have been continuing that model. We raise money for Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, and the most recent project was the podcast, which is all devoted to focusing on activist origin stories and getting people to vote in the midterm elections. So.
Excellent. All right. Well, please, I'm looking forward to this conversation. So I'll let you go.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here for this really important conversation about gun safety. I am delighted to be accompanied by two amazing panelists. So I'm just going to get on with it and bring up our first panelist. His name is Michael Skolnik. He is the partner and co-founder of the Soze agency. Come on, Michael. It's a creative agency that works with companies, nonprofits, organizations, and movements to create campaigns that uplift compassion, authenticity, and equity. And very good.
Very well done.
Previously, Michael served as president of Global Grind, which was a media company focused on a millennial audience, and he spent over a decade as an award-winning film director and producer. So
and that's when I had hair.
Yes, so being involved may cause you to lose your hair, but it's worth it, right, Michael?
My son has this beautiful curly red hair and says, I took your hair, Daddy, put it on my head. So I've lost mine, I've given it to him.
If you follow Michael on Twitter, you can see evidence of that curly, beautiful head of hair on his little boy. But we have a lot to get through in a little bit of time. So Michael, thank you so much for being here with us. Can you just tell me briefly, since we're starting a gun safety panel, how you got involved in that particular issue?
Yeah, I grew up in New York, and I had a very sort of interesting childhood, adolescence that for another time. But when I was a teenager, I was living in New York City. My parents sort of blessed me to go live in New York City on my own for the summer times, and during the year I'd work in New York. New York City in the 90s, in the late 80s, early 90s, there was 2,300 homicides a year. So oftentimes we talk about and we sort of objectify Chicago as this place that has a lot of violence, and it does. And there are places in Chicago that do not, right? And there are people in Chicago who are fighting every single day to end that violence. But in Chicago, you have about 500 homicides a year now. And in a bad weekend, Labor Day weekend, Memorial Day weekend, you're seeing in Chicago, 30 to 50 shootings and upwards of 10 to 15 people killed. In New York City, in the 80s and 90s, we were seeing that almost every day, all year round. And so I grew up, I remember in 95, Oprah made a special on gun violence. And I was a 17-year-old high school student interested in filmmaking and theater and the arts. And I took that hour special, made a 1 minute sort of short film called One Shot about gun violence in America when I was 17 years old. And since then, I have, it just came to me. My cousin was murdered 9 months ago. He was a 75-year-old multimillionaire power attorney in California. And it was on, some of you might have heard this story, it was in Long Beach. It was on New Year's Eve day. And he had fired his law partner, and the guy had come back the next day and shot him and killed him. And my mother called me. I called my mother, it's her first cousin, like her brother, and she was, of course, I had to tell her the news. She was in hysterics, and she said to me, Michael, you have to keep fighting. You have to keep fighting. Now it's personal for us. And I said to my mother, I said, I love you, but I've been doing this so it wouldn't be personal to us. And sadly, it now has become. And then a young man who I knew, the mother and father were dear friends of mine for 20 years, was just shot in Jacksonville a week and a half ago at the football Madden tournament. So I've been passionate in this issue. I sit on the board of the Trayvon Martin Foundation. I'm very close to Trayvon's family. And Lucy McBath, who's running for Congress in Georgia 6, who's the mother of Jordan Davis. We love Lucy. I was with them in the trial, every single day as trying just to comfort the families. And I've now had a chance to work with the students in Parkland and the families.
So let's talk about them for a little bit, because you've been involved in the gun violence movement. You've also been involved in social movements in general. The Parkland students, the March for Our Lives, the larger March for Our Lives that's encompassing students all over the country, has been a really remarkable movement to watch. Even if it's not on the news every single day anymore or on the front page of the paper, it's still very visible. These students are super active. In addition to organizing one of the largest marches in 5 weeks, they have spent the entire summer registering voters. They started town hall campaigns all over the country, and they've also, given platform to people who were previously not giving access to news media because they're not white. We're going to be a panel of white people talking today, and it's important to reference that. Why do you think this movement in particular is so successful in terms, obviously they haven't changed everything, but there have been a lot of laws that have changed since February on a state level.
53.
That's 53 laws have changed?
Yeah, the most we've ever seen after any incident in American history.
So what do you think are the core elements of this movement that are so successful, and how do they sustain it going forward? Well,
I spoke to them 2 days after the shooting. They reached out to me on social media and said, we followed, one of them said, I follow you and I respect you and admire you, and we went to this thing and it's horrific, and can you help us? And we don't really know what to do. And then I spoke to Emma Gonzalez the morning of her speech, just as I'd say hello. I didn't know who she was. She was a teenager from Parkland, Florida, and I was in my car with my curly redhead 5-year-old in the back, and he was asleep. And we were in New York City on 2nd Avenue at Smoothie's place, and Paola, my partner, who's an amazing activist in her own right and filmmaker, she wanted to get a smoothie, and I was looking at my Twitter, and there's this video of this young woman saying, "We call BS," and I was like, holy shit, like this is a moment in American history that I tweeted. I said, please watch all 7 minutes, like watch the whole thing, don't just watch the clips. And that tweet then got 150,000 retweets and became just a place you could watch it, right? And then that night they called me and said, we want to do a march, and you've done marches, and can you help us with I chair the board of the foundation that oversaw the Women's March that Harry Belafonte started, and I helped with the Science March. So I've become part of this march business weird thing that's happened since the guy on the street has taken office. What I think, and I know there's a lot of folks here who work for brands, and we work with a lot of brands and causes, and I think what's different is this thing and this thing that's in my pocket, right? Is 20 years ago, if you worked for McDonald's, if you were in HR, if you were in customer relations for McDonald's, and somebody had a bad experience in one of your franchises, they would send you a letter, you'd send them some coupons, say, I'm sorry this happened to you. Please have some apple pie coupons, and here's 10 of them, and we're so sorry. If it happens now, they go on Twitter, and it becomes an international story. This happened, look at Starbucks, right? Prime example. And I'm not going to pick on Starbucks, so that could have been that could have been Dunkin' Donuts, that could have been Subway. It could have been any place, because we have an issue at race, no matter if it's in Starbucks or in Dunkin' Donuts or in, Subway. So this thing, right, what the students have done and what they did is they didn't expose gun violence. We know there's gun violence in this country. We're numb to it. Right, we push it away. We don't want to deal with it, but we know it exists. What the students said is these jokers in Washington, right, are so corrupted they won't even protect children. That's sick. That's not even like political. It's just sick. It's a disease. It's like cancer inside of us that somehow, some way, nobody wants to treat. Because the person who has the drugs has dug a hole and said it will cost $200 million to get it out. And nobody wants to pay the $200 million. And so the students and Emma in that moment, and the parents, and you'll meet one of my heroes, I'm so happy I'm coming before him. But the parents and the students said, enough already of the sickness of corruption, of the sickness of a politician saying, the leader of the Senate, just 2 weeks ago, you can Google his name, said, there's nothing we can do. That's just some money bird flying by his head and saying, here's $30 million, Mr. McConnell, just be quiet. Just be quiet. And so what the students exposed through this apparatus in my car on 2nd Avenue in New York City, I watched it on my computer in my pocket, not my telephone. They say it's a phone. Anyone from Apple, you do a great job calling this an iPhone, but it's a computer in my pocket. I watched this young woman tell the world it's bullshit.
Yep.
And then they said, we don't want your money. We don't want your endorsements. We don't want your politicians coming on our stage. We will tell our story. We will do it our way. We will have our own rally. We will travel the country on our own dime. And corporations, and we were blessed enough to participate, and I get to see it from a front row seat, but corporations like Lyft and corporations like the hamburger place that Danny Meyer started, someone talked about him, what's that nice place? Shake Shack, places like Shake Shack, thank you, and Gucci and other places came forward and said, and American Eagle and Levi's, right, $1 million just last week, right, amazing, that came forward and said, we have to respond. Because this is our consumer. Nike didn't do, Kaepernick's a buddy of mine, Nike didn't do that commercial with Colin because they feel they're always on his side of justice. They believe in the justice and they believe that the consumer is demanding it. And that's young people with this. So I know I don't want to take up his time.
No.
His time is a lot more precious than my time. I said enough.
We've referred to the hymn many times, so let's bring our next guest out. Thank you, Michael. That was wonderful, and we'll be talking more. But please welcome to the stage Fred Guttenberg. Thank you,
I'm going to give you that middle seat there.
Thank you, Fred. Fred is the co-founder of the nonprofit organization Orange Ribbons for Jamie. I'm going to let him talk to you more about what that means and why. Previously, Fred was an executive at Johnson & Johnson. He was an entrepreneur and an owner of 19 Dunkin' Donuts franchises. And he is basically spending his time now challenging our elected officials to do more. And he is aggressively pursuing strategies to enhance public safety and enact common sense gun safety and turn out the vote. So, Fred, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
I know you want to address the audience first, so let's just let you go and do that, and then we'll get to some more questions.
To get something out of the way.
Absolutely.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes.
My name is Fred Guttenberg.
Hi, Fred Guttenberg.
I am the father of Jamie Guttenberg, who was killed in Parkland. Thank you.
It's an honor to shake your hand.
I am now involved in Handshake Gate. But that is exactly what I said to Kavanaugh. It is what I say to every single person who does not know me and who I may be talking to about what happened. And I do it to be honest. There is only one thing that matters to me in my life right now, and it is this issue of gun violence and gun safety. And I don't ever want to approach someone and not have them know that up front. So it is the way I introduce myself to every single person. And candidly, he looked at me until the part where I said murdered in Parkland. He looked at me long enough to see my bracelets, which commemorate my daughter, because after lunch when I got pulled out by 3 DC police officers and questioned, they wanted to know what was on my bracelets. So at the end of the day, I want to take a minute to tell you my story and tell you why I'm here and what we need to do. My daughter, Jamie, went to school on February 14th with my son. I sent them that day like any other day. And honestly, probably like any other morning, it was chaotic. They were probably running late. My dogs were barking. My wife and I were probably yelling at them to get out of the house. It will haunt me for the rest of my life that I don't remember if I said to my daughter the very last time I saw her, I love you. That is reality of what happened and what was taken from me. Because that day, I sent them to school and only my son came home. My daughter is the toughest person I ever knew. My daughter fought for her life until the very last second. We know that because unfortunately she was one of the kids that was shot in the hallway, and it's on video. And she ran for her life. She needed one more second until boom, a single shot to her spine as she was turning into the stairwell. Paralyzed. I don't know if she died instantly or not. I don't know if she suffered. I will worry about that for the rest of my life. And every day going forward is a reminder of what I lost. Birthdays, holidays, Mother's Day, Father's Day. Even Tuesday morning, when Dianne Feinstein introduced me as a guest at the hearings, I was crying. And it wasn't because of pride that I was there. It was because of the reason that I was there. So what I wanted to tell Kavanaugh, if I had had the chance, because I don't miss a chance to talk to everyone who I hope will listen if they're in a position of potential power. I wanted to tell him I live in Parkland, one of the greatest, safest neighborhoods in this country. I live in that neighborhood where people say, never in my neighborhood, it won't happen here. That's where I live. And I wanted to tell Kavanaugh that he lives in a neighborhood similar to that, and it could happen in his, and he might be dealing with this in his children's school next. And I was hopeful that he would listen to that message and take that under advisement when he has to make future decisions on the issue of guns, should he be selected. Based on his comments this week, we need to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. Let me take a step back. A few months before my daughter was murdered, my brother died from cancer related to his service in 9/11. He ran the triage at the World Trade Center. Two distinctly American tragedies. In one, this country took action. In the other one, this country stands still. This election is our time to vote this cancer out.
That's right.
And we must vote. Gun safety is not partisan. I do work with people on both sides of the aisle. However, the response often is partisan. One side remains relatively silent. Our current majority leader stood in front of the Senate about a month and a half ago and in essence said, if you're looking to do anything about guns, don't look here. We won't be dealing with it in this body. That was the day where I started taking stands on candidates. That was the day. I've got something, I call it the orange wave in November. For me, this November is all about selecting candidates who will do something about gun safety. And making sure that when the new Congress sits in January, you have members who are sitting next to somebody who is new, because the person who was there before got fired for their stand on gun safety. I want Mitch McConnell fired from his leadership position. He doesn't deserve it. I don't want to be the father who has to travel this year visiting future shooting tragedies victims. I want to be the father who can work with everybody and encourage people to vote so that we fix it before that happens. So thank you for listening to me, and I'm free to take questions.
Thank you, Fred. Just on a really low level first, can you talk about just some of the stuff that you're doing that is creating change so far? You've been out meeting with people, meeting with legislators, meeting with business owners, I believe. Can you talk about some of the specific things that you're doing that you feel have gotten the message across?
Well, I'll start with the businesses. Businesses are actually being heroic on this issue right now. And I'm proud to say I've played a role with some of those companies that are taking some real positive direction. And I'm proud to say that I'm working with some other companies that will be making announcements that are going to be really significant in culture shifting. But in the failure of the legislative process in D.C. to take action, our businesses are leading the way. But so are states. And I've been traveling this country, going state to state. Listen, and not just states that are Democratic-led. I was with Governor Baker in Massachusetts, a state that already had probably the best gun laws in the country, and by the way, he's a Republican, but was looking to make them better, and they did. They passed red flag laws. I've met with Governor Kasich in Ohio, a state that is not a Democratic state, but he wants to do something, okay? I was part of what we did in Florida. The states are taking action and doing something. Here is my fear. Every single time a state passes gun safety legislation, the NRA is filing a lawsuit. Mm-hmm. And they're filing bad lawsuits. What they're trying to do is actually lose. And the reason they want to lose is they want to be able to keep on appealing all the way up to the Supreme Court. That is the reason they're spending so much money to get Kavanaugh selected. Because if that conservative bloc is on the Supreme Court, they'll have this decided in a way that will put in it will make achieving gun safety a lot harder. So we must keep on working to get these laws passed, but we must take our commitment to vote very seriously. And between now and November, I'm done talking about policy. I only want to talk to people about making sure they will vote and how to get them to vote.
So on that subject, getting people to vote, obviously a huge challenge in this country for lots of reasons. One reason was addressed in a prior panel. You know, we have voter suppression here. However, getting people to vote on specific issues is another challenge in itself, because I've done a lot of phone banking on the gun safety issue, and I get people on the phone and I tell them their senator's NRA rating, and they're shocked. You know, they don't have any idea. So what's the easiest way for people to get that kind of information to make sure that they're voting in orange candidates in November?
Well, first thing I would say, social media is an amazing tool.
Yeah.
And we need to utilize it because, and I'll give you an example on the ratings. The NRA used to be really proud of those ratings until this election cycle, and then they pulled them off their website. So we need to make sure people do know those ratings. The majority of this country wants gun safety legislation. And my advice is, amongst your candidates, make sure you know their stand. Make this the number one issue you vote for in this election. There's so much clutter in the news cycle right now. There's so much happening that focus on something like this, and you'll pick somebody who actually cares about your public safety. That's a reason to vote. So my advice is try to avoid the constant barrage of noise that can exhaust you, and focus on this issue and vote on it.
I want to bring up 3D printed guns. You had a wonderful op-ed on this recently, which is at your website, Orange Ribbons for Jamie. Probably people are aware, 3D printed guns came up in the news recently because our wonderful president just made it very easy for them to be available as blueprints for downloads. This has been stopped currently, but this is an issue we're now going to have to contend with, is the accessibility of guns through 3D printers potentially. How does this change the debate around what we're fighting for, and do we have to fight differently for different sets of laws to worry about this unbelievable problem in addition to fighting for just sensible gun safety laws?
So I was in DC about 2 months ago, and I was actually addressing the House caucus. And I started talking about the issue of 3D guns because 1 week after my visit to DC was when this was going to become a reality. And the reason it was going to become a reality is this administration did a deal with an anarchist to allow him to go ahead and do this. They basically settled a lawsuit that the administration had already previously won, allowing him to do this. This administration unleashed the era of undetectable weapons, potentially the biggest safety setback in this country in my lifetime. And they really didn't tell anybody. People like us in the gun violence prevention movement knew about it because it showed up in some tech journal about 6 weeks before that, and I had been tweeting about it. When I was talking to the caucus, none of them knew. And there was only a week left to deal with it. And fortunately, we were able to get enough people in D.C. to take it seriously and across the states to file lawsuits. But here's my advice to all of you. And I call it, the Trump dog biscuits, because every hour there's a new news cycle about something else that just happened, and it's like we can't keep up with it. Try to avoid the constantly shifting news cycle and pay attention to what's happening beneath the surface. because there's some really, really important things going on that you all need to know about. And this was just one example of that. The bottom line is we currently, and I say gun safety is not partisan, but I will say this. Only one side stood up and took leadership on this issue when we made it known, and the other side sat silent. So gun safety is not partisan, but the response to it has been, and you need to vote as if your life depends on it.
I think we probably only have time for one or two audience questions that I want to get in. So this can be to both of you. First question, could ammunition regulation be an easier path to avoid the partisan divide when it comes to gun safety?
I love that question. I think, and there are some House members who are working on legislation, any time ammunition is bought, there should be a background check. And it avoids all of the loopholes, because whether or not somebody buys a gun over a fence, in a backyard, car to car, they can't use it if they don't have ammunition. So anytime ammunition is bought, it should be part of a requirement for a background check. And so the answer is yes.
Do you have anything to add? Okay. Next question is, how do you get people to care about gun violence beyond the news cycle, or care about daily gun violence in inner cities as much as school shootings? Big problem, big question.
Yeah, I would just quickly, I would say that this moment in March for Our Lives or Parkland, the sort of Parkland effect, and I've worked a lot with the students talking about this, for hours and hours. We just traveled the country. We did 60 days across the country in 20 states and 175 stops. We spent a lot of time together. Fred was with us in many of the stops across the country. We discussed, and along the way, in the spirit of the Freedom Riders of the 60s, we'd pick up young people from Chicago. We had 7 we took from Chicago, and then Milwaukee and St. Louis and Ferguson, and then Standing Rock. And then so by the end, there was over 100 young people who had traveled the country with us from all different communities who had been affected by all kinds of gun violence. But we talked about a lot was the connection to sort of this youth movement that's been happening in this country. It certainly has been happening for a long time, not just with the reaction to Trump. And that we have to look at the death of Trayvon Martin as a catalyst for Black Lives Matter that leads into Ferguson, and give the proper respect to those young people who sat 400 days on the streets of Ferguson, fighting for their lives against a police force who was tear gassing them and shooting, water hoses at them like the 60s. And then leading into, young people coming to Washington and demanding President Obama, deal with undocumented young people and pass, or sign an executive order of DACA. And then LGBTQ movement of young people saying, to their parents, love is love. We saw in India today, a historic victory in the Supreme Court in India. But here in this country, that love is love, and their parents were wrong. And we saw, marriage equality pass. And then Standing Rock, young people, fighting for water, and water is life. And then the Women's March and the Science March, and then March for Our Lives, right? So there's this wave of youth activism over the past 8 to 10 years that has now connected these young people in ways that a kid from Chicago and a kid from Parkland can have a conversation, sadly, about pain in a way that they hadn't been connected in the past. And so we went to Standing Rock, and we went to the border in El Paso with the Parkland students and talked about these kids being taken away from their parents and put in cages, and tried to have these intersectional conversations that it wasn't, and the students from Parkland understood their privilege, but I told them, never apologize for your pain. Even though you have privilege, you still went through something, you experience something that's real, and connect on compassion. Don't connect on judgment of, is your pain worse than my pain, or is my pain worse than your pain? And so I believe so deeply in young people, and I know Fred has been, sort of a uncle to these students, and has been there and believes in them and gives them that, that courage to keep going. And so I think in November, compassion will win. Not to say Democrats or Republicans, but compassion will win, because young people are demanding a compassionate response. Whether it's from a corporation, whether it's from a politician, whether it's from a community, they're demanding a compassionate response.
Yeah. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Fred?
The only thing I'll say to the question is, shootings are happening every day. Today, 3 people died in Cincinnati. It's impossible to not stay responsive to it. And it can be your block, your bank, your mall, your movie theater, your school next.
That's right.
And so every day, the most important thing we do is we focus on the safety of those we love. Every day, just remember, people die because of gun violence, and go to the polls planning to do something about it. So, thank you.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.